Hey, so welcome back to another video. So in today's video, we're actually going to be building a news app in SwiftUI. So this app is to basically simulate like a take-home coding test. So just to show you it, so we're going to basically build this app, which basically you can see has a loading screen. It also uses an API. It's structured with MVVM, combine. We also use Swift Package Manager to handle downloading the images asynchronously and a lot of other good stuff as well, such as error handling. So without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. So for this tutorial, we're essentially going to be using a API, obviously, but the API we're going to be using is built by my guy here, Jordan Singer. So he's a developer based in America, I believe, who has great work on, Swift UI things. So I definitely check out his GitHub here. I'll also put a link so you can check it out and, you can see and learn some more Swift UI stuff. Sorry, Jordan, if I butchered your name, man. It's the Manchester accent, you know what I mean? But we're going to be going on to his site called Little APIs. So we're actually going to be using the news API and we're basically going to look at the data that we get back from this and see how we can apply this to our app. And the reason why we're using this is because it's so minimal and it's so simple to use. Like there's not a lot of data, so we can just quickly prototype something. So let's get straight into the API now. Cool, so let's create a new project. So we're just going to say file, new, and then obviously a project. And then we'll get the options here. So let's select app. After we do that, let's put in our product name. So I'm just going to call this test news app. And then you'll see that we have our bundle identifier for interface, SwiftUI, lifecycle, SwiftUI app, language, Swift, next. Cool. And then let's put this somewhere on the desktop. Yeah, cool. So now that we've done that, the first thing you'll realize is that obviously Xcode has generated. So if I just expand this, Xcode has generated this for us automatically. Let's replace this content view with our own view. So I want you to go to the folder that you just created for your project, right click, create a new group. Let's call this views. And then inside of views, we'll create a new file. And then we'll create a new SwiftUI view next. And then in this file, I'm just going to call this home view. Cool. And then what I'm now going to do is I'm now going to basically replace the main content view with the home view. So just want you to delete this content view file. And then it's an awful name, test news app. We're going to replace that with home view. Cool. All right, sweet. So now we've got the base of our, stuff set up. And if we just go to our preview here, we just hit resume. All right, cool. So the next thing that we need to do is essentially we need to set up our model. So let's do that now. Cool. So now we know where we're going to be getting our data from. So let's actually see how we can build our codable models so we can actually start the process of building our, API classes. So what we need to do is I want to copy this URL. Now I'm using a tool called Postman. You don't have to use this. You could just literally copy it from here if you want to, but for the ease of this, I'm going to be using Postman. So if you've never heard of what Postman is, it's literally a tool that allows you to basically inspect and test and debug APIs and whatnot. So if you do download Postman, I'll put a link on the screen here. So all you need to do is just hit the plus button here, and I'm just going to paste that URL into here, and then I'm going to make sure this is get, because it's a get request this, and then hit send. And now when it finishes, we get the entire response and we can easily and nicely inspect our data. So now what I want you to do is just copy all of this. And then there's a really handy site that easily basically turns our JSON into codable objects, and it's called app.quicktime. I'll put a link again on the screen. I'm treating you guys. So essentially what I want you to do is just paste it on the left hand side here. And as you can see on the right hand side, it should generate the struct for you. So you can just literally copy and paste this, because we're now going to use this in our project. So if you go back to the project, if you just create a new folder, called model. So this is where we're going to put our model for the API response. I'm just going to create a new file called news response. And then within this file, what we're just going to do is we're just going to copy the structs that it automatically generated for us. I'm just going to paste it below. Now it tries its best to do it. Obviously, we don't want this to be called welcome because it doesn't really have any context. So to make it clear, I'm going to call this news response. I'm going to leave this as article, which is fine. And as you can see, it's all good. Now, if you're unsure as to what this is, so this is basically just the coding keys. So essentially, if we go back to our API, you can see there's a key called description in the response. And on this line here, it basically says article description is equal to description. Now, the reason why it's doing that is because description is actually already a reserved word in Swift. So you cannot use this word, but just to save time, this generated a new key for us called article description. So this is what it's going to do. It's going to basically look for description and put that inside of the key matching article description. So what we need to do now is we need to actually make this struct identifiable. So the reason why is because this is what we're going to be showing in our list. And when you're using lists in SwiftUI, you basically need to make each item unique. If you don't do that, then basically it's not going to like it. So let's do that now. So in order to do that, it's pretty simple. All we need to do is just type identifiable. And then we just need to add an ID like so. So now what we need to do is we need to actually set up our endpoint. So let's do that now. So let's create a new folder called endpoint. So we just right click on your project folder here, new group, and then we'll call this endpoint. Cool. Let's create a new Swift file. We just want to call this news endpoint. Okay, cool. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to basically build a protocol called API Builder. So I'm going to type this out and then I'll explain the purpose of what it is. Okay, cool. So let's just break this down. So essentially what we have here is we have a protocol called API Builder. So why a protocol? So the reason why I decided to use a protocol was because if there was another API that we needed to add, like let's say, for example, there was a reviews endpoint, we can basically reuse this protocol to get these properties and almost copy the same pattern that we're about to do now. So it basically helps promote reusability. So we have URL requests. So this is the URL request that we're going to basically send to the, using our code. The base URL is the base URL that we're going to basically have for the API. And the path is going to be the path that we want to basically retrieve the resource. So the next thing we need to do is define our API. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to be using an enum. Cool. So we basically created an enum called news API and a case get news. Now we've only got one case here, but let's say, for example, if we had multiple other endpoints for this news API, this is where we'll basically add them. So now let's carry on. And what we're going to do now is we're actually going to basically build out our API using an extension on our protocol so that we basically have a nice, clear, sort of like defined network layer. So let's do that now. So it's also worth noting as well that when you do this extension and you're using the protocol, it actually will complain and say that you need to conform to the protocol. So remember before when I said that we want to use this, these properties here. And so what will happen now is when I hit the little fix, we'll now automatically get these properties that I set before. And we can now basically define the URL request, the base URL, and the path for each one of our cases in our API. Now, obviously we only have one, so we're just gonna do it for the one. So I'm gonna type this out and then we'll explain it a bit more again. Okay, cool. So now let's break this down. So what we've actually got here now is we basically got our base URL. So our base URL is the URL of the API. We now have our path. So the path is the resource that we want to access. And at the end, finally, we actually have our URL request. So what we're basically saying here is we want to basically get the base URL for the enum that we've declared. And then what we want to do is we then want to basically add the path onto the end of that URL. So essentially that will basically build this entire string that we'll be using to call the API. So now that we've built our endpoint, the next thing that we probably want to look at is also setting up our errors. So let's do that now. Let's create a new folder, new group again. This time we're going to call it error. And then within this, we're going to create a new Swift file. And then we're going to call this network, well, not network, we could call it a network, but we'll call it API error. Okay, cool. So essentially for the API errors, what we're going to basically use is an enum, and it's going to be of an error. So let's do that now. So cool. So let's just break this down a bit. So we've wrote an enum called API error, and it is of an error. So now we can basically treat this enum like it is an error itself. And then now we have cases. So the first case we have is decoding error. So decoding error will handle if the object failed to decode. So let's say, for example, the structure of the data from the JSON changes. We'll throw this case. We have error code, which will basically throw a status code. So if we get like a 500 or 401 or anything like that, and it's got an associated value for int for the status code. And we've also got a case called unknown. So unknown will just handle any kind of error that it doesn't really know or hasn't taken into account for. So what we need to do is we basically need to give each one of these errors their own description. So in order to do that, we actually need to write an extension for the API error on the type a localized error. So let's do that now and we'll discuss it a bit. Okay, cool, back in the room. So let's go through this now. So decoding error. So what we're basically saying here is if we get one of these error cases, and we're basically going to give each case its own description so it's clear as to what's gone wrong. So if it's failed to decode, it will show this message. If the falls into the error case with the error code, then we'll show the error code and then say something went wrong. And if it's unknown, then we'll just say the error is unknown. So now that we've got this all set up, we can now move on to creating our service. So let's do that next. Okay, cool. So let's now move on to our service. So I'm going to create a new folder called service. And I'm just going to create a new file called news service. Right, cool. So for our service, we're basically, obviously, to interact with the API and the whole architecture of the project, it's going to be using MVVM. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to basically separate concerns by using protocols and promoting the idea of dependency injection. So let's get started and do that now. So the first thing we need to do before we even start with anything is we actually need to import combine, because we want to use combine so we can actually listen to the changes from when we call the API. So what you need to do is just import at the top here, combine. And then after you finish importing combine, the next thing you need to do is you need to basically create a protocol. So let's create this protocol for our service. Now, the reason why we create this protocol is because, like I said earlier, we want to promote the idea of dependency injection. So we want to make this class as testable as it could possibly be. And this is quite a common programming, practice in iOS that you'll see a lot of people doing. So within our service, we're going to create a function that almost triggers our request. So this function is going to essentially return a publisher. And what we'll do in our view model when we get to that bit is we'll basically listen to the event that it publishes. So let's type this function out now. So I'm just going to type out function and then request. Right, cool. So we're basically using our API that we built before to basically dictate which endpoint we actually trigger. And if you actually look at our code a bit more closely, we actually have this new object here. If you never saw it before, it's just the any publisher. So any publisher is what allows us to subscribe and listen to the event that we want to publish. Now we basically have this, so any publisher uses generics. So we have the first definition here, which is basically the success, as you could say, and this is what we're going to send back as the news response. And then we have the second one, which is the error, which is going to send back the API error. Now looking at this might be very familiar to you who used result before, and it is pretty much the exact same. The only difference is with result, you either get success or failure. With any publisher, you basically listen to the subscribe to what it's publishing. So now what we want to do is we want to implement this with our news service struct. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So you're probably wondering, what's wrong with this brother, man? Why is he using a struct? Well, essentially the reason why I'm using a struct is because I want this to basically be lightweight. Essentially, what we're basically saying here is that this new service, this is going to be the implementation of it. And the implementation of this new service is this request function here. So now if I wanted to, I could actually mock this class because we're using this protocol. So now we've got this error basically saying that we're missing a return for the publisher, because obviously it's expecting us to return a publisher. So what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to basically type out the base, and then I'm going to basically slowly add on top of it for you guys, and we'll go through each step. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So essentially, we're just going to basically break this down bit by bit. So the first thing we need to do is when we're calling an API service, we actually use something called URL session. Now, if you're already familiar with this, then great. You kind of understand the purpose of what this is. So essentially, this is what you use to send API calls in iOS development. So what we want to do is we want to access the singleton that URL shared offers. We want to access the singleton that URL session offers. And then what we then want to do is we want to use data task publisher. So data task publisher is what we get now with the new combined framework to basically listen to the result of the service, so we can publish a value using the subscriptions. And for this, we're going to basically pass in our URL request that we created in our news API. So we're going to be using this URL request that we build here. Then what we do is we basically receive this on the main thread. So the reason why we need to listen to this on the main thread is because when you're working with APIs, you want to call it on a background thread. So you don't want it to basically block the main thread when you call the service. Now, by default, URL session does this, so it calls it asynchronously in the background. But when you receive the response back from the service, you want to make sure you put this back onto the main thread. And the reason why is because you don't want the UI to be out of date, number one, and you can actually cause a crash if it's out of sync with the threading. So that's why we basically say here, receive it on the main thread. Then after we finish doing that, the next thing we do is we basically try to map it to any errors. So if something went wrong when we called the API, then we will basically map the error to an unknown error in our enum API and return that. So finally, what we do is we basically flat map. So we basically try to flatten everything that we get back from the API response. So we have our data here, which is the actual data from the API, and we have our response, which contains all the information about the response that we got back from the service. And as you can see here, the flat map is expecting us to return a publisher. That's why we're getting this error here, because we need to actually fill out some stuff here, but this is just the base. We're still going to add on top of it. So essentially, the publisher expects it to return either similar to what we have here before, the news response and error API. And you can see here, finally at the end, we actually erase this to our publisher. So essentially what we're saying here is the value that we get back, we just want to convert it into a publisher, a generic publisher that you can basically send back, and thus listen to the value. So essentially what we need to do in the flat map now is we basically need to define and handle the errors and handle decoding our object back from the service. So let's do that now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're basically going to check to see if our response is okay. Now, if our response is nil, then we'll just basically throw back an unknown error. We'll just throw back an unknown error, or else we'll carry on and we'll get onto that bit next. So let's do the first bit now. All right, cool. So essentially what we're saying here is we want to basically get our response and then we want to basically cast it. So cast it as a HTTP URL response. Now, if this fails, then we don't know what went wrong. So we're just going to throw back a failure object. So the failure object, and then we're going to basically turn that into a generic publisher so we can subscribe to this and then do something else later on. So if this passes, then what we want to do is we want to check if the response falls within the valid codes. So let's do that now. So we're going to say if, and then we're just going to basically use a range here. So I'm going to say 200 to 299. So contains, and then we're going to say response.status code or else. All right, cool. So if it's within this status code, then we want to basically try and decode the object, or else we want to send back a error. So let's do that now. So I think the first thing we'll do is we'll basically handle the case of if we don't get a good status code. So let's do that here. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to return fail error, and then the error is going to be API error dot error code. And then for the error code here, we're just going to basically say response.status code. And then again, at the end of this, we're just going to say erase to any publisher. So essentially what we're saying here is, we just close this to create some more space. So essentially what we're saying here is when, if we basically are not within the values 200 to 299, then we want to basically return a failure object, and the error is going to be our API error with the error code, and the error code will be our status code that we get back from our response, and then we just create a generic publisher again. So in here we want to try and decode our object, so let's do that now. So in order to do that, we're going to basically use the just object, and then we're going to pass in our data. So now we want to actually use this decoder property to actually decode our object. So let's use this now. And we actually have this property called decoder. Now it's actually really important that we use this, because if we look at our API, so I'll just quickly go back to Postman. There's actually a property here called date. Now the date is actually a string. Now normally when you're working with dates, with a service, you don't want to handle them as strings. You want to basically convert it into a date object when you get it back. So if we look at our model that we have in a news response, so we actually do have a property called date, and we've defined it as a date. Now, if you've already done this before, you might already be aware of this, but basically the JSON decoder object that you can create, you actually have a property called date decoding, and we want to actually use that to convert our string automatically into a date object for us. So let's do that now. So in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a decoder. So we're just going to say let JSON decoder, and then JSON decoder. And then the JSON decoder has a property called date decoding strategy. So we don't want to use the data one, we want to use the date one, and then hit enter. And then we want to use the ISO 8601 format, because that is what our date format normally is. But now what we want to do is we want to pass our JSON decoder into here. So the next thing that we want to try and do after we finish trying to decode this is we want to basically throw an error if it fails. So let's do that now. So again, we're just going to use map error, and I'm hoping you're starting to see a pattern here with the way that we basically try something, and then either if something fails, map it to an error, or else just carry on and return it as a publisher. And then here we're going to use API error, but this time we're going to use the decoding error. And then now what we're going to do is we're basically going to say erase to any publisher as usual. Okay, cool. So now we actually do have our class here for our service, and to basically call the API, and depending on what happens, it will either throw a fail, or it will try and decode the object and return the object to us. So for our API, we're actually going to be using, as well as the MVVM, we're going to be using states. So we're going to be using states to basically drive a different state of what's actually going on. So let's look into that now. So for our app, we're basically going to be using states. Now, we basically want to declare 3 states for our app. So when we publish these states using an enum, enum cases, I should say, actually, the view that you see on the screen will change. So let's jump into doing that straight away right now. So the first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to create a new folder called states. And then in this file, in this folder, I should say, sorry, I want to create a new file called ResultState. And then we're going to create a brand new enum here. So we're going to create an enum called ResultState. And like I said before, the ResultState is what's going to control what content the user sees on the screen. So the first one we're going to do is loading. So for loading, we're just going to show a loading spinner. We're going to have another one called success. And for success, we'll return the array of articles. So this is what we'll use to populate our list of articles. And then finally, we'll have another one called failed. And then for failed, to keep it generic, we'll use the error. So we won't tie it directly to API error. So we'll just basically use the error type. So essentially, what we're going to do in our view model next is, depending on the state that gets sent to the view, we'll basically then change the way our app looks. So let's create a new folder again. So we'll create a new folder this time called viewmodel. And then within our view model, we'll create a new file called newsviewmodel. And following on from before, where we basically separated our concerns by using a protocol to make our classes more less coupled, we're going to do the same thing here again. So the first thing I need to do is to import combine, since we're going to be using combine here. And then what I want to do is just type the protocol definition, so news view model. And then within the news view model, we're basically going to have a function called get articles. Just delete all this generated stuff here. Cool. Now what we're going to do is we're going to create a class, which is going to be an observable object, and it's going to implement our protocol. So let's do that now, and we'll talk a bit about why a class in a second. So let's just break this down. So why do I use a class here and not a struct? So the reason why I use a class is because I want this class to be an observable object. Now I want to basically observe the changes that happens to the data inside of this class. So what we have now is we have an observable object, which is what we're going to use to observe the changes within our class. We've got our news view model implementation of our news view model, and we're basically adhering to the news view model to basically use this function called get articles. So now if we want to basically unit test this class, we basically got what we need to basically create a mock of this view model if we needed to. But what I want to do now is I want to basically introduce that concept of dependency injection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a property where we inject our service into this class. So let's do that now. So now we've done it, where we have our service and we're basically going to inject our new service into this class. And now we can use our service to basically start off the request to basically get our articles. And it's worth noting that I didn't use the new service impler. I used new service, the protocol new service. So that if we were to create a mock object of this, we could just easily, inject it into this class. Now, this is a really basic example of dependency injection. So the next thing that we need to do is we basically need to actually create our array, which is going to hold our articles. So let's do that now. Now, if you've never saw this keyword private set, or just the keyword private in general. So what private means is that you can't actually access this from outside of the class. So it basically just protects it. And with this private set, essentially what we're saying is we want to basically protect it within the class, but you can still access it from outside the class. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to basically create a set of cancellables. So the reason why you need a collection of cancellables is because when you call the service, you need to basically keep it in memory. If you don't store it somewhere in memory, then essentially when you call the service, it just gets disposed of. So your API request will actually never trigger. So it's really important that you have like a collection that holds your requests. So finally, the next thing that we need to basically create at the top here is we need to actually use our enum with our result state that we said before, so we can actually push to the front end what the current state is of the service. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So now we've basically got this. So this is our state. So this is what we could be listening to, and we're basically giving it a default value of loading, because the first time when we load the app, it's going to be loading. So that's just the default value. But we still need to add something extra to this because we actually want to listen to whenever this variable that we have changes. So in order to do that, we need to use the annotation in SwiftUI from Combine called published. So let's do that now. So now that we've added published, and what we're essentially saying here is we're going to listen to whenever the state changes. So whenever this state changes, this enum, so whenever the value changes to any of these three values, we're going to basically react and do something. And our do something is change the view that's on the screen. Okay, cool. So now that we've got our properties all lined up nice and ready to go, the next thing that we need to do now is actually call our service to basically trigger an API call. So let's do that now. So in order to do that, we want to basically create a constant called cancelable. And then within cancelable, we want to use our service that we've injected to basically call the request function. So we're going to say service.request from, and now all we need to do here is say dot get news. And then what we want to do is we essentially want to use a function that comes with publishers called sync. So we're going to use sync. And what sync essentially does is it basically allows us to listen to the completion as to whether if it was successful or a failure. And it also allows us to listen to, I'm struggling with doing the number 3 then. It also allows us to listen to when it's finished basically publishing. So let's do that now. So the first thing we're going to do here with this sync is we're going to basically listen and subscribe to the completion. So this is when it finishes. So in here, we're just going to say res. And then on the receive value, as you can see, this is the news response. So in here, we're going to call this response. Okay, cool. And then we'll work with the receive value first. So within receive value, what we want to say is that when we actually get, so when this finishes and we actually get the value from the request, we want to basically put it in our articles array so we can basically maintain our articles. So I'm just going to say in here self.articles is equal to response.articles. That's pretty much it. Nice and easy. And then what we're basically going to do here is we're basically going to listen to the result, and then based on the result do something. So let's do that now. So we're just going to say switch and then res, and then when we do that, it will suggest to us that, hey, it needs to be exhaustive. And you can see now that we get 2 new cases. So we get one for finished and one for failure. So let's do the finish. So the finished one here, what we actually want to do is we want to basically send back the articles. And just put a break here. And then for the failure, we want to send back the error and then put a break here. And then for the failure in the associated value, we just want to say let error. All right, cool. So now let's just basically work our way through the states that we're going to handle. So by default, the state is loading, but just to ensure that it's always loading, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say self.state, is equal to dot loading. Okay, cool. And then what I'm going to say here on finished is I'm going to say self.state is equal to dot success. And then for the content, we're basically going to use the articles that we've captured from before. So let's put that in here. So self.articles. And then for the failure, we're going to say self.state is equal to dot failed. And then again, the error that we passed through our request, we're just going to pass that through here. And that's pretty much it. So now we've got it passing through. So let's just clean this up a bit. So now we have our states. So we have the loading state, we have the success state, and we have the fail state. So depending on the state, when it changes, these will get triggered. Now this will not work because at the start I said that we need to actually hold this in memory. So what we now need to do is we need to actually use this cancelable and actually insert it into our set. So let's do that now. So at the end here, let's say self.cancellables.insert, and then we're going to insert this cancelable here. So copy it and just put it in here. So put that cancelable in here, and then cool. So we've done that. Now just go on to GitHub and you search for a library called url/dim image. And then what we can essentially do is let it do the caching and the asynchronous downloading for us. So let's use this in our project now. So if you just scroll down on the GitHub page, there'll be a link to installation. So if you just go to installation, now where you can use CocoaPods if you want to use CocoaPods. Me personally, for this tutorial, I'm going to use Swift Package Manager. So to use the Swift Package Manager, all you need to do is literally just copy this URL. So right click on it, copy it, then go into your project, go to file, and then if you scroll down, you'll see Swift packages, I should say, and then add package dependency. And then in here, you just want to paste the URL and then hit next, and then it will download it. So next, and then now it's starting to resolve it and download it. So let's just wait for this to finish downloading. Cool. So now we've got it. Just hit finish. Okay, cool. So now we have this in our project. And if you can see here at the bottom, here you'll see Swift package dependencies, which is that. So what I want you to do is if you just go into your folder called views, I want you to create a new view, a new SwiftUI view called ArticleView. So let's create ArticleView. And then in here, I basically just want you to literally just import the framework. So the library, I should say, actually. So let's build our article view. So just so we can sort of see this more easily, I'm going to put these side by side next to each other. So let's just do that now. All right, cool. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to basically handle this image if we have a valid URL and if we don't have a valid URL. So in order to do that, we're going to basically use optional chaining to basically see whether we should display the image using the library or like a placeholder image. So let's do that now. So what we're going to do is, because this is all like a horizontal layout at the start, we're going to create a H stack. So we're going to create a H stack, and then within this H stack, we're just going to basically leave this like this for now. So what we need to do now is we need to basically get this image from the article, and the way to do that is to basically create a property here at the top. So at the top here, let's create a new property called article, and it's going to be of type article. Right, cool. Now this is going to complain to us because we need to now inject an article into here. So what we're going to do is we're going to just go, oh, thought I heard like a fox in my house or something. Anyway, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go to jump to definition, and we're going to go to our article model, and then we're going to basically create some dummy data for it. So all you need to do is just literally just say extension on article, and then static var, and then we're going to call this dummy data, and then it's going to be a computer property that returns a article, and then we're just going to say init. So initialize it, and then all I'm going to literally do is just copy and paste some values from our response in postman. Okay, cool. So I've copied that dummy data here. Now I've actually realized something with my model. So what I've realized is actually some of these are not optional, and I do want them to be optional. So what we're going to do is we just got to update our model quickly. So we're going to make the parameters like so optional, like so. Okay, cool. So now that we've updated our models to be optional parameters and we've got our dummy data, we can now use this. Okay, cool. So now they're optional. So why did I make them optional? So the reason why I made them optional was because let's say in the event that the API returns nothing, it won't crash. So what we're going to do now is we're going to now use this dummy data in our SwiftUI view. So in here, we're going to basically hit the fix, and then we're just going to say article dot dummy data. And now when we build it, we don't get any more errors. So now let's start to build the image like we said before. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically say if let image URL is equal to article dot image. And then what I'm going to say again is if let URL is equal to the URL of the string one. So where it says string, you want to use the string one, image URL. Then we're going to create our image URL, or else we're going to create a broken image, like there's a broken image placeholder kind of thing. So let's use our URL image library first, and let's build up this asynchronous image object. So let's define our URL image. So we're going to say URL image like so. And then I'm just going to basically define this parameter by parameter, because there's quite a few parameters, it can get quite big. So what I'm just going to say here is I'm just going to basically use the parameter URL. So we're going to say URL, and then we're going to pass in the URL. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to basically put a comma there and hit enter. And now we're going to use the content parameter. So we're going to say content, and then content expects you to return a image. So what we need to do here is we need to basically need to use the image that we get, and then we need to apply some sort of modifiers on that. So the reason why I've said fill is because I just want it to fill the entire box. I don't want it to fit and you'll have like white space at the top. I just want it to expand and fill everything. All right, cool. Just go to the documentation and we just scroll down. You'll see here that there's a parameter in the URL image called options. So essentially we want to just use all of this. So let's look at doing this now. So let's just put in our options, and then we're going to say URL image options, and then we're just going to create the struct like so, and then remember to put the comma on the end of it so it basically doesn't complain. And then in here we're just going to hit enter to create some space, and then I'm going to basically create the new key called identifier. And then within here, we're going to use our UDID from our article as our identifier. So we'll just say article.id.uid string. And then for our cache policy, we're basically going to use the return cache else loaded. So for our cache delay, we're actually going to enter in nil because we don't want to delay it. And for our download delay, we're just going to do a small download delay of 0.25 seconds. Okay, cool. So we have one more case that we need to handle. Now that we've added in our caching policy, we need to basically handle if this fails. So if this fails, we want to show like just a generic image. And for that, we're going to use SF symbols. So let's do that now. So just on top of the content here, just hit enter again. Okay, cool. So let's look at the documentation. So we want to actually use the failure to say if something's gone wrong. So let's do that now. So above content, we're just going to say failure. And it's going to be like so. And then just close it off. And then remember to put the comma at the end of it. Cool. And then within failure, if you look at the documentation, we get an error and a retry. So what we're going to do here is we're basically going to say error. And then for the retry, we're not going to use this, so we're just going to do that. So now what we're going to use is we're now going to basically use SF symbols to basically create a placeholder image just to show that something's gone wrong. So let's do that now. So essentially what's going to happen now, we just break this down, what we've just done. So essentially what we've got is we're using the URL image. So we've got a URL, we have our options for our caching options. We have our failure. So if it fails, this is what's going to get presented to the user. And we basically have the content that we want to basically show, so the image when this successfully passes. Now, one thing that we're going to need to do on the URL image is actually give it a size, because right now it doesn't actually have a size, which is why it looks really, really small like this. So at the end here of this parentheses, what we want to do is we just want to basically say dot frame, and then we want to give it a height of 100 by 100, so you can see how it's now gotten bigger. And we want to take out the alignment because we don't need that no more. But what we're going to do is we're basically going to give this a corner radius of 10. So when you see the image, when we test it out, you'll see the corner radius is set to 10. And what we essentially want to do is show this image when it fails. So if the image is nil and it can't like successfully get the values, so as a fallback, we want to show the placeholder image. But I don't know if you've clocked something now. So we're actually now repeating ourselves. So this isn't best practice. So realistically, what we should do is probably turn this into its own like kind of view. So let's do that here now. So here, we're just going to basically do this. So we're just going to create a new struct. And we're just going to call this placeholder image view. And if you just look at the syntax of what you need, it needs to basically be of type, it needs to be a view. And then what we then need to do is we need to basically define a body. So let's do that now. So we're going to say var body some view, like so. And then essentially what we're going to do is just going to copy, we're just going to copy all of this and put it in here, like so. And then rather than us using this duplicate code like so, we're just going to replace this with our placeholder image view like this. Cool. So now we've stopped ourselves from repeating the code, and we basically got a reusable placeholder image view that we can use anywhere. Right, cool. So we're not done just yet. So what we need to do now is we need to basically define the titles. So this one is actually going to be pretty straightforward. So in order to do this, we're just going to use a VStack, because if you look at the layout, it's basically going down vertically. So stack, and then we're basically going to say we want the alignment. So we want the alignment to align leading to the left hand side. So we're just going to say leading, and we want to add some spacing of 4. Let's just say 4 for now. So spacing of 4, and then we want to close that off like so. Okay, cool. So then what we want to do is we want to create some text. So essentially now what we've done is we've actually built this. So just so I can preview what this is going to look like as its own component and not a device, I'm actually going to go here and say preview layout, and then I'm going to say size that fits. Right, cool. And now it looks more like a component. I personally just prefer to make it look like a component rather than getting the whole device. That's just my personal preference. So cool, this is looking good. So the next view that we need to build is our error state view. So let's do that next. So in our views folder, let's create a new view called ErrorView. So essentially, this is going to be the view that gets shown to the user when something goes wrong. So let's build this out now. What we need to do is we need to basically, first of all, inject the error into this view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constant, and it's going to be of type error, and then it's cool, like so. So now the error view in the preview should complain, which is fine. And to fix this, we're just going to use a error from our API error. So we'll say API error, and we'll just use the decoding one just to show what it will look like. All right, cool. So now let's build up our view. So we're going to say VStack, and then we'll start off with the image first. Cool. So now we got this nice little icon here. So the next thing that we need to do is the text. So let's do that now. I want to increase the space between these two because it looks like it's quite tight. So what I'm going to say is on the image, I'm going to add a bottom padding, say 4. All right, cool. Sweet. And now what we're going to do is we're going to create another text. So this text is what's going to hold the error message. Now let's add our button in. So I'm just going to add a button. Okay, cool. So now we built our UI. What I'm actually going to do again is I'm just going to basically, you don't need to do this. I just prefer to do it to make it fit to make it look like the component. I just prefer doing it that way. You don't have to do this. All right, cool. So now we've done this. What we now need to do is we now basically need to create a closure for our button. So when someone taps on a button, essentially what we want is we want to basically trigger a closure so we can do something. So in order to do that, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to create a type alias in this view. So let's do that now. So type alias, and I'm going to call this ErrorView action handler. And then this ErrorView action handler is just basically going to be a closure that returns void. So I'm just going to create the handler for this. So underneath the error, let's just say let, and then handler. And then we're going to use our type alias. And then now what we're going to do is we're going to generate a initializer for this, so we can basically use this handler. So I'm going to click on the struct here. So hold down Command on your keyboard and then click on the ErrorView, and then you should get an option to generate the initializer. Let's do that. Cool. You want to copy this and then paste it underneath here. Cool. And I'm just going to hit enter just to make this more readable. Cool. And then we're going to get an error saying that we can't assign it. And the reason why is because we want to use this handler outside of this scope here. So we actually want to use the handler way down here. Now, in order to do that, we need to basically mark this as escaping. So let's do that now. All right, cool. So now what we've essentially said is we're going to use this completion handler outside of the current scope. So let's do that now. So we're just going to go here. I'm just going to say handler, and then we're going to create our parentheses there. Cool. And then if you scroll down, you'll see you have an error saying that you're missing the parameter handler. Now to fix this is actually quite simple. So all you need to do is just literally just add 2 curly braces like so. That's pretty much it. All right, cool. So now we've got it where if we press the button on the retry, it will essentially basically throw back a completion handler so we can actually do something. So it's worth noting as well that when you're doing this, you want the handler to be the last parameter, just so it's more nicer, and you don't have the handler before you're setting all this stuff up. It's just nicer to read, in my opinion. All right, cool. So the next thing we're going to do is we're now going to bring all of this together and then see how we can basically track the states of our app and then go from there. So let's do that now. Okay, so let's start to hook all of this up now. So all we need to do, we just go to our project. So we go into our main home view. What we want to do now is we want to basically create our view model, because that's what we're going to use to essentially call the service. So let's do that now. So here we're going to create our view model. So I'm just going to say var and then view model, and it's going to be the news view model implementation. And then for the service, we're just going to basically inject our service. So we're going to say news service implementation and then do it like that. So if you remember our view model implementation, we said it was an observable object. So what that means is that we want to basically observe the changes that happen within this class. Now, starting from iOS 14 and above, Apple introduced a new annotation called state object. So we're going to use that. Okay, cool. If you're someone who needs to use iOS 13, then I would recommend that you actually use observed object here. So, but rather than using observed object, we're going to use state object. And the reason being is because the state object will basically make sure that when our app leaves the current state, it's maintained in memory, so we don't really lose the current object. So we're going to use that. And now what we need to do is we now need to actually hook up our states that we set up in our view model and change and swap out the views depending on the result of the service. So let's do that now. So the first thing we need to do is delete our text here, and then we're just going to say group. So we're going to use a group. When the view appears, so when the group appears on the screen, we're going to basically call a function to basically, call the service. Now I'm going to use a different way of typing this rather than using the closure. So I'm actually going to pass the function directly into this. So in order to do that, we just want to do appear and then perform and then that, and then we just want to type view model. So our view model dot get articles. So what this is essentially doing is when the view will appear, it will basically trigger or call our function get articles. So this is like a really shorthand way of writing this. It's a really nice way of doing it. So in our group, we're going to observe the states that we get back from the service. So let's do that now. So we're going to say switch, and then we're going to say view model state, like so. So now let's add in our different states. So we're going to say case dot loading, and then for loading, we're just going to return a progress view. Cool. And then we're going to do the error one. So case dot failed. And then remember, because it has a associated value, we're going to say let error. And then we're going to create our error view here. Cool. And then we're going to have our handler like so. So we're going to say error. And then for the handler, again, we're just going to say view model dot get articles. And then we're going to say case dot success. And then this is going to give us our articles. And then for here, we're going to basically create a navigation view. Within our navigation view, we're going to need to use a list. So let's do that now. So we're going to say list, and then within our list, we're going to say articles, and then we're going to create the curly braces, and then we're going to say, we're just going to say item in, and then this is where we'll pass it into our article view. So we're going to say article view, like so, and then we're going to pass in the item, and then on the list, we're going to basically give our view a title and a navigation view. So we're going to say navigation title, and then it's going to be of text. And then this is just going to say news, like so. All right, cool. So now let's just take a step back because we did a lot of typing there. So essentially what we're going to do here is on the switch, we're going to basically check the state. If the current state is loading, then we want to show the progress view. If the current state is failed, then we want to basically create the error view, and we'll pass in our error so we can display an error onto the screen. And also as well, when someone taps the retry button, so remember the handler that we created. So whenever someone taps the retry button, we will essentially call the function to get the articles. So you can see here how we're doing it in line similar to what we do here. So it's just more readable. And then finally on the case success, so when it's successful, we get the articles, we create a navigation view. And then when we create our navigation view, we have a list. And within our list, we pass in our articles, which basically has an item. And then this list will iterate through our identifiable objects, which is our articles. And then we get our item, we pass that into our article view. So this gets configured based off the article that's being injected into it. And then finally on the list, we basically give our navigation view a title of the text news. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to run this and see what happens. So let's do that now. So I'm just going to choose a simulator, and I'm just going to hit run. I'm just going to take this out full screen so we can just see the simulator pop up. Let's see what happens. So you can see the loading dialog, and you can now see all the articles showing up in the news app, and you can also see that our images are being fetched asynchronously, and if it's successful, it's fine. So we've not actually had an image yet that's failed, so it was able to successfully get all the images. And when we're scrolling through the list, you can see that because they're being cached, they're not being pulled again from the service, so it's pretty efficient, the list. Okay, cool. So now what we need to do is we need to basically add the functionality, so when you tap on it, it will basically take you to Safari. So let's do that now. So all we need to do is, if we just open up, let's go into Xcode. I'm just going to close my canvas so I can get more space to show you guys. So all we need to do is on the article view, we need to basically add a tap gesture. And then when we add the tap gesture, we then need to use the environment to basically open up the URL. So let's do this first now. So first what we need to do is at the top here, we need to basically type in our property to basically access the open URL UI application properties. So this will allow us to basically use the system to open up a link in Safari. So let's do this now. So you want to type @environment, and then you want to put the parentheses, and then we want to use the key path dot open URL, and then we're going to create a property var open URL. So essentially what we're saying here is we want to basically access the system's capabilities to open up links. So let's do that. So then what we want to do is we want to basically create a function in here. So we'll just create a function, we'll just call it load, and then we'll say URL, and it will take an optional string. It won't return anything. And then what we're going to do is we're going to basically say guard let link URL, and then let URL is equal to URL, and then we're going to use the string option of the parentheses, and then link, and then else. We're just going to return, so we don't want anything to happen. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use our open URL to basically load our link. So what we're going to use is we're going to use our open URL at the top here to basically open up our link. So let's do that now. So open URL, and then we're literally just going to pass in our URL like so. Right, cool. And then all we need to do now is we need to attach a tap gesture to our article view. So when you tap on the article view, we'll trigger this. So in this case, we're going to use a tap gesture. So for this, we're going to use the closure. So I can just show you the difference between using this, where you can do it inline, or if you want to use, you have to use a closure. So we're just going to do tap gesture. So we'll say load URL, and then we're going to basically pass in our item dot URL. Okay, cool. So now let's run this. See what happens. If we tap on it, cool. You can see now it opens up the link in Safari, and we get at the top where we can easily just go back into our app. All right, sweet. So we built that, but we actually didn't test out and see what our ErrorView looks like, or how to basically get it to appear. So the easiest way to do it is to simply, if you just stop the app from running, if you just go to your machine, and then on Wi-Fi, if you just turn off the Wi-Fi, and then if you just run the app, cool. So you can now see that we get our error screen, and if you hit retry, it's actually going to try and call the endpoint, but obviously because we're not connected to the internet, it's not going to work. So let's connect back to the internet. So let's turn our Wi-Fi back on. Cool. And now if we hit retry, we get a loading spinner, and it works again. All right, cool. So hopefully you've learned a lot from this. So this is just basically a really simple example of like a take-home kind of challenge that you might get from like a company that you're applying for, or just in general. So one thing I do want you to do as a challenge as well is underneath the source here, I basically want you to put the date and format it. So it'll be like published and then a time format. So that's a little challenge for you guys. As usual, if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. And as usual as well, obviously, you can, share the video, comment as well if you have any feedback as well. And also don't forget to subscribe to help the channel grow. That's everything from me. I'll catch you guys in a bit. Deuces.